Well, I'll start. I'll ask what will seem first to be a pedantic, technical, Husserlian question, but I think it gets at a very important point. So I'll start with this idea of the epoche. So the Husserlian idea of the epoche becomes reformulated, reinscribed, but nonetheless centerpiece of the political. Now, I guess the question is the epoche and institution, the epoche and residual, but what about the reduction? Because, so this is a technical question, that in Husserl, of course, in order to, so the epoche is a kind of movement of neutralization or suspension, which then allows for a certain kind of question, which is a question of constitution of validity, so it almost has a political vocabulary right there. That's the constitution of what you're calling meaning structures and their validity, and I want to understand the constitution, and then the movement of reduction, or the method of reduction, is what gets us from the epoche to that as an actual question, to an actual, I mean, Husserl wouldn't take the language of shaping, obviously. So the question is, where's the reduction, and why that's important is for two reasons. One is, it seems that the way in which you were presenting how Patočka, and I think you were reflecting Patočka's own description, the epoche, and it's a technical question. From a Husserlian point of view, that's not the epoche, that's what Husserl calls Neutralitätsmodifikation. I won't get into the details, but Husserl makes this distinction in ideas between the suspension, which is suspension of natural attitude, etc. But then he thinks that there's this other kind of act, if you wish, that he calls neutrality modification. And what's different between, what neutrality modification and epoche have in common is neutrality modification is the capacity to be completely indifferent to my beliefs, to any beliefs, and therefore to any investment in the world. Such that it's a kind of attitude of total disinterestedness, where I'm not attached to beliefs, and that is why he calls it neutrality. It's a model. That's different than epoche, because the epoche, in a sense, is a true method. So the epoche is, so an example of Neutralitätsmodifikation is in Sartre, the experience of nausea. The experience of nausea is a neutrality modification because the world is completely suspended. And instead then there is in Sartre the horror of the nothingness of the true, etc. So I use that as an example because you see very clearly that that's a shaking. That's a kind of rupture with the world. That's a neutrality modification pushed to the extreme, but not an epoche. And why it's not an epoche is that, at least within let's call it the point of departure for this discussion, within the Husserl's thinking, the epoche always leads to something called the reduction. And then the argument is the reduction has different interpretations, and my sense is maybe what is missing in here is that Patočka, I think, has this Heideggerian idea that the moment of reduction is not simply the epoche as the shaking of the whole, but then in relationship to this whole, something like a transcendence. Because I think Patočka accepts this Heideggerian reformulation of the reduction. The reduction reveals that the structure of Dasein is always projection into being, which transcends the whole of beings. So that's the reduction leads us to that, so to speak. So it's a kind of technical question, but I guess what's important is this moment of transcendence, which we've been talking about, that the transcendence of the good, and whether it's, and I think that's important because if it's more something like neutrality modification, then I think, and I'll end here, then your tension, I think, becomes very pronounced and acute between institutionalization and epoche. Because indeed, with the neutrality modification, it seems to be irreconcilable to normalization. It's always a state of exception. And that's the great brilliance of Sartre, to have taken this very technical idea of Husserl and to have given it a kind of existential inflection. Nausea can never be normalized. If, however, we're talking about epoche and reduction, then prima facie that's not antithetical to normalization or institutionalization, because the prime example for that for Husserl is mathematics and geometry. In The Origin of Geometry, I make an epoche of geometry. but geometry has to be institutionalized, and I'm not claiming that I'm changing the institution, though there is a kind of the Constitution. Now, of course, politics is not mathematics, but it's an example where you could perform an epoche on mathematics, which has to be institutionalized, and it's not antithetical. So, by definition, the epoche is not antithetical or not under the prohibition of institutionalization. Neutrality modification definitely is in that sense.
I mean, I think, I'm not going to, I think that probably there is some there's some conceptual confusion and lack of clarity, maybe on Patočka's part, but also on my part. Nonetheless, the distinction that you just referred to there is extremely important, of course, because it's important to the question of whether or not the epoche understood politically is something that could be institutionalized. I think you're right, perhaps, that for Patočka, when we have these discussions of the front, when we have this, it is something like, it's some variation of a neutrality modification in that sense. But it's not. Of course, it's not neutrality because it's destruction, and that's something different. It's not that I become neutral to all meaning structures. It's that they are literally ripped out from under me in a certain sense. I guess the question that I'm concerned with, to a certain extent, more concretely, is, well, can we think about this activity, which has, for Patočka, enormous political significance, in a way that is in fact iterable, or is in fact institutionalizable? And there, absolutely, and that's why that's why the relation with the idea of these vocational epoches, in fact, becomes important, because politics is indeed a kind of strange vocation, but it's a vocation that has, let's say, as its sphere of validity, the entirety of the life world, not just one habitual domain of it. So in that sense, I can see that there is perhaps actually a good reason for retaining this notion of epoche, insofar as what I'm interested in is precisely the possibility of institutionalization and the possibility of how to negotiate what seems to be Patočka's prohibition of normalization or prohibition of institutionalization. I don't know, there's always a difficulty with Patočka, because there we start to get rather, I think his writing is not entirely clear either about what is the residual in that sense. And veers between sometimes, I think, a more Heideggerian sense, and also sometimes between something that comes close to resembling in its emphasis on embodiment and movement. So that second part of my answer is not really a response to your question. The first part maybe is something like a response.
I'll just add two things. It's interesting what you say. You can, again, I'll speak within a very clear model, which is not a political model, but it's a Husserlian model. You can institutionalize indeterminacy, because that is the very structure of any validity of meaning. Because the thing is ultimately something like a structure of indeterminacy. And the epoche and the reduction is meant in a source to understand the particular configuration of how indeterminacy becomes institutionalized in validities which we otherwise don't see as such.
I think is to understand the determination and determinacy.
That's right.
The limitations.
That's right. So that's the way in which maybe the idea here is how to institutionalize the epoche, is how to institutionalize in the sense of indeterminacy actively. And so the institutionalization of indeterminacy would be something like the institutionalization of the epoche.
No, I think, but what I'm trying to find a way to describe is precisely institutionalization of the epoche in this sense. But the difficulty is, of course, to retain some of the radicality of what Patočka describes.
Because this will be my final thing. What struck me when I was listening to your paper is, it's always puzzled me in the heretical essays, is that if you compare the analysis of the First World War as the epoche, the solitary, the shaken, so polemos, violence, with the analysis of Socrates and the birth of the polis, etc., one is clearly war. The frontal movements.
Yeah.
The original Socratic moment is not. Because he doesn't, so he calls it polemos war, but it's literally not a war. It's, you might say, the structure of a kind of dialogue. So I wonder, so it's a kind of question, I wonder if one of the difficulties in the heretical essay, and I'll just formulate it, that when he reads Socrates, that truly is epoche and reduction. But then by the time you get to the First World War, that's more like a radical neutrality modification.
Yeah.
And it becomes even more pronounced once you take the mysticism out of the description of like Dila de Chardin. Because in Dila de Chardin, the mysticism is that moment of reduction.
Yeah.
But if you say, okay, well, let's get rid of the mysticism, then it seems that maybe that's a kind of strange imbalance in the analysis that, so at the end, it's more like a neutrality modification, and that's the frontier lateness, but at the beginning, it's more like an epoche and a reduction, and then the question is, how do you reconcile those two?
Well, that's helpful in a sense, I think. I mean, I guess the issue is that also in the heretical essays, in the second one particularly, I mean, he does describe the advent of history, the advent of political in confrontational terms, in terms of being a member of one community against another community, actually. And as this space where precisely all the historical givens are shaken. So there is still that element of polemos in that account of it.
It's definitely polemos, but what's odd is you could imagine if you wanted to keep a kind of structural balance between the beginning and the end, you would explicitly situate Socrates and the Republic in the Peloponnesian War. And you would try to show that the First World War is structurally similar to the Peloponnesian War, and that the origin of philosophy is in the aftermath of the destruction of Athens, which is clearly the Republic and all of Plato's dialogues, is the trauma of the Peloponnesian War. How is it that Athens was destroyed? But Patočka doesn't do that. So though he speaks of polemos, he doesn't historicize it specifically with the Peloponnesian War, which if he did, then it would seem to somehow be more balanced. So the fact that he doesn't, the question is it an omission, is it deliberate? So I think that's the complication, that it's polemos, but not war in the sense that the First World War is.
That could have something to do, of course, with the I mean, he says it's not an idealization of the Greek polis, but often, of course, it does seem to be that. Whereas following the First World War, there is a sense of utter, I mean, there is a sense of utter despair, almost in a Heideggerian sense of only God will save us now, and that could have something to do with the violence, the difference, that being the difference. Thank you.
This other question, which I think relates to the conversation just now, in the sense that if there is a structural parallel, say, between the Peloponnesian War and the First World War, and Patočka suggests this solidarity of the shaken, which you then interpret as a kind of a community of phenomenologists. I guess my question then would be, which do we opt in terms of Socrates or Plato? Because in Plato there's the philosopher kings who maybe figure in so which is it? Like, is that the solidarity of the shaken in terms of the phenomenologists, or do we opt for Socrates, which is far more indeterminate? So if you would bring that into the picture, there's an additional kind of distinction there to be made, I think, to
I think that's precisely why in that sixth heretical essay he's very clear. One of the few very, very clear things in the essay: the solidarity of the shaken shall not speak in positive programs. So it's very clearly stated that this is not a vanguard that emerges out of the destruction of the First World War. Actually, that will then have the responsibility of constructing the state where Socrates doesn't have to be put to death. So he's very much aware of that and very wary of that. So in that sense, I think if your question is between Socrates and Plato, then it's Socrates. But then again, we have the problem of institutionalization again. So
yeah,
I mean that's one of the things. I mean, so. Francesco read an earlier version of this paper, and his criticism, which I think was a very valid one, but which I sort of ignored, was, look, Patočka's political philosophy doesn't work in the context of trying to talk about Western democratic institutions. It's a philosophy of dissidence. And I probably, so I intentionally said, well, okay, I'll take that into consideration and still try and bang my head against the wall here. But I think that is the problem exactly there that comes up.
But I think it's fair to use these categories also in another context, of course. So this is maybe the future of this kind of stance. So.
But it seems to me that you have a very wide meaning of institution.
Certainly.
So maybe that's also a problem there if you narrow down the concept of institution. Because then you could get, I think it was the vocabulary you were using or someone about how does solidarity become mobilized? So how does it transform? I think you use that vocabulary. How does dissidence become mobilized into something like an institution?
Yeah.
If one has a narrower meaning of institution, then maybe one can try to come to terms with that more easily than if one has a very wide meaning. I mean, what comes to mind is this is a very Sartrean problem. Because in Sartre, it's a different world, but it's the same problem. In Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, you have the same problem. How is it that his vocabulary, the fused group, which is a structure of dissidence, which is not institutionalized, then mobilize itself into something like an institution or a program, and then there's a kind of dynamic there, but there he has a kind of narrow notion of institutionalization, which allows him to sort of come to terms a bit more closely with the problem. Not saying that he solves it, but maybe that's something also to think about.
Well, I'm quite wedded to my broad conception of institution. I mean, because I think that as soon as we try to narrow the concept of institution, we run into precisely the problem of, well, why are we narrowing it in the way that we are? I mean, and so I want to hold on to this very broad idea that institution is some sort of a sense structure, but also a formal object, and then also a form of life. But that's a very, very broad notion of institution that makes everything an institution in a certain sense. So perhaps rather than limiting the notion of institution, it would be important to establish some gradations within the concept of institution. Yeah.
Just a little. The fourth section seems the most problematic to me, and I was curious. I mean, your description of the residuum of the epoche, I didn't find particularly. Well, I mean, for instance, you said, and you're speaking specifically of the First World War, and it was a very, very powerful evocation of kind of the level of destruction that the continent experienced. But then you said, what's left? What's the residuum? You have a kind of shell-shocked, half shell-shocked soldier on the field with his compatriots. But you said, you listed several things which are not left, kind of collective memory, national identity. You listed several, I don't know the exact words, that are not left. But then in a sense, you look at the interwar history, there was an attempt to set up the League of Nations.
Yeah.
There was definitely a lot of poetry written about the kind of dissolution of these identities. But actually what you see is very, very quickly, collective memory, myths of origin, national identities recrystallized, remilitarized. And so I was just kind of curious how the empirical framing of the residuum sits with the empirical, or rather how the empirical framing of the epoche sits with the empirical description of the residuum, because if you link the epoche to the specific historical upheaval, then it seems that the residuum also has to sort of align, or you at least have to face the question of how your description of the residuum aligns with the interwar period, I guess, was my own.
I'm not sure about that, to be honest, because the interwar period, in the way that you just characterized it, of course, is not the residuum of the epoch. It's the immediate re-establishment of institutions. So I think, but your question, I think, is absolutely accurate in another sense. That I mean, that residuum cannot be, and I think that's probably a problem in how I presented it. That residuum cannot be, shall we say, as bare as there has to be. I mean, there have to be. There have to already be some trace or some residue of meaning structures for the subject to move in relation to. The other subject is, of course, or the other body is, of course, one of those. But I think that to think about this more politically, you're probably right that it's necessary to not speak about it in terms of utter destruction, and that's perhaps a problem in terms of speaking about it in relation to the experience of the front and the First World War. Because if we're going to talk about an institutionalized space, in that sense, institutionalized political space, it's not the space of utter destruction, but the space of a certain methodological activity, actually, a methodological dissembling of institutions. There, of course, the term Rückfrage comes back from Husserl's methodological tracing, the genesis of ideal objects. So that would be somewhat. So I think you're right. That would be somewhat different. What I was, in a way, the challenge I tried to take up was to take these descriptions that we have from the heretical essays of the front, and then to look at these descriptions that you have in the phenomenological papers, which are of course written in an entirely different context and for an entirely different audience, where he takes up the question of movement and the question of embodiment and the question of freedom and responsibility, but in an entirely different way, and to try to bring them together in some ways, to think, well, what he says about movement and embodiment in those more phenomenological texts has to then apply also to what he says about the experience of the front. I think that is the case, but that does leave problems as well, and it especially leaves problems when we then try to politicize that idea. So yeah.
But just as a little footnote, this idea of of describing the experience of the front as a reduction already happened during the war with some of Husserl students.
I didn't know.
So one of Husserl's students, a guy called Dietrich Manke, who wrote a dissertation on Leibniz and became a sort of important Leibniz scholar after the war, was a soldier, was wounded, and wrote a very short little book called Die Ewigkeit des Krieges, The Eternity of War. And it dedicated to Husserl. He wrote it while he was convalescing in some hospital, published in 1917. And it has the most amazing, first pages where he says, I'm in the trenches, bombs are blowing up, it's all horrible, and I'm reading the logical investigations, and I finally understand the reduction. I finally understand the log. So I think there's something deeply, and I don't know if Patočka knew this text, it wasn't a well-known text, but there's definitely something, in a sense, something is very accurate about saying the war can be understood philosophically as something like a reduction. Then the debate is how to understand that, because it's something that others, and there's even, I just discovered the other day, in the archives we have a small little text, again by a very unknown student of Husserl's who was a soldier, called Phänomenologie der Kriegslandschaft, phenomenology of the war landscape, because it's precisely, I'm in here in the trenches and it's utter devastation, et cetera. So that's just a small little thing. This is a different thing. I was very interested in this Clausewitzian formula, and almost the reversal of the Clausewitzian formula. So, war, continuation of politics by other means, becomes politics as continuation of war by other means. As you know, that's also Foucault's in Society, very provocative thing about how, in a sense, politics, it's an inversion and things like that.
There's a, sorry. I was going to say that, there's a relatively undiscussed but quite close relationship between some of Patočka's and some of.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about.
Foucault's
So,
texts,
because also in Foucault, that's tied to biopower, things like that. So I just was curious if you had that in mind at this point, because that's very suggestive.
Absolutely. There's these ideas that you find much better worked out in Foucault, biopolitics, biopower, are very much present in some of Patočka's texts, actually, and particularly when he's discussing the metaphysics of force, or in some of the notes where he's much more critical about economic liberalism and these sort of things. Actually, at the end of that text, the Schema of History, he goes into this discussion, which seems out of place in a sense, about philosophy of life, actually, and the reduction to, not reduction in the phenomenological sense, but the reduction of the human being to biology, basically. And then the discussion of the management of that biology, actually, which is precisely what biopolitics is for Foucault. So I think that absolutely what comes after this metaphysics of forces, or what I call, or what I think an economy of forces, and that would be another way of talking about, is absolutely related to these ideas that we find in Foucault around the same period, actually, from the mid to late 70s, about biopower, biopolitics, and of course this idea about what is actually the concept of race becomes important for Foucault there as well. The relation between race and war, this idea about a cleavage in society.
And then the care of the self.
Yes, yeah.
Which is absolutely,
yeah. So I didn't know, and again I credit Francesco for the point that Foucault actually mentions Patočka twice in his Collège de France lectures. Neither time in any great detail, actually. But so I think they were both seemingly relatively unaware. I mean, Foucault is developing these ideas at the very end of Patočka's life, so I think he wouldn't have been Patočka.
Actually, yeah, he quotes him the first time in the year in which Patočka dies, 1977, just in a footnote, very briefly, in Territoire.
Sécurité, territoire, population.
And the second one more widely in the course about the care of the self compared to the care of the soul.
Did Patočka read Pierre Hadot? Because this whole theme of Greek philosophy is about the care of the self, the care of the soul is really.
I'm not sure.
That's something that
yes,
Hadot develops in the early 70s.
Totally sure.
At the Collège de France, Foucault is talking to Pierre Hadot and approaches that. And I was wondering, so it's just a question, if somehow.
I'm sure that he never quotes Foucault. Yeah, I never found a quotation. But Pierre Hadot, it could be. We should check. Do you think, Darian, that this idea of institution can actually be useful also to rethink the relation between Patočka and Europe? Because normally the typical confrontation is based on the idea of embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if actually there is some new path that we can follow in that direction.
I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm very biased. So I think that the concept of institutions can solve all sorts of, or can help us address all sorts of problems. Certainly, I do think.
Of course, I'm referring to the course by Merleau-Ponty about institutions.
About institutions. I mean, the idea of institutions is developed there, but also in other places by Merleau-Ponty. Also in Adventures of the Dialectic, it becomes the central component of his philosophy of history. I always had the impression that Patočka lacks a theory or a developed theory of institution the way Merleau-Ponty has. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that I've always thought was that if we think about each of their development from Husserl, Patočka develops more the idea of the appliqué, while Merleau-Ponty picks up this idea of Stiftung, and that becomes really the central component of his later thought. So I mean, I think probably some fruitful confrontation there is possible, in which, yes, a more developed notion of institution might help us to understand something and to better formulate a political, a more in-depth political philosophy on the basis of Patočka's thought.
I see you're all tired. But anyway, it leaves me just to thank Darian.
Thank you.